As EU member states agree to impose sanctions on violent Israeli settlers, a member of the European Parliament says it's not nearly enough to make a difference.
Just sanctioning 1-2 organizations or 1 or 2 individuals, is not going to cut it. You can say we took some measures, but basically structurally you're still funding, financing and arming the entire, Israeli enterprise of colonization.
Marc Botenga accuses Brussels of hypocrisy when it comes to the Middle East.
If you wouldn't be giving the weapons, that you wouldn't be funding Israel, maybe those bombs wouldn't be falling. If you'd be condemning Israel, sanctioning Israel for what it is doing in Lebanon, for what it is doing throughout the region, they might actually stop the conflict, stop the wars.
Hello, I'm Rida Fakhri. Welcome to the program. As violence against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank continues, the European Union has agreed on sanctions targeting Israeli settlers and settler-linked organizations. This followed the recent change of government in Hungary, which had long blocked these measures. The EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, said the move was intended to show that, quote, violence and extremism carry consequences. But human rights groups argue the measures remain limited, as they do not include broader penalties or sanctions on senior Israeli ministers. Several European nations, including Spain, Ireland, and Slovenia, are pushing for the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which underpins trade and political relations between the two, to be suspended on human rights grounds, while Germany, Italy, and others oppose the move despite growing pressure for a review. So to what extent does this expose the limits of the EU's ability or willingness to enforce accountability?
We reached a political agreement to sanction Israeli extremist settlers and entities.
We are a people who are friends of the people of Israel, but no, we do not agree with the actions being taken by their government. And a government that violates international law and therefore violates the principles and values of the European Union cannot be a partner of the European Union.
This is our land, our state. We are here. We're going to be here forever. We will never establish a Palestinian state here. And we are taking control all over the area. We are building more than 68, a new settlement here in Judea and Samaria.
Ladies and gentlemen, the federal government I lead will never leave any doubt about where we stand. We stand with Israel.
One of the most vocal critics of EU foreign policy has been Marc Botenga, a Belgian member of the European Parliament. He is vice chair of the Left Group and sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee.
High Representative Kallas, you speak about a balanced approach. But balanced on what? On war crimes? On genocide? On mass graves? On the killing of children? And what would that balance be exactly? Some nice words for the Palestinians, more weapons for Israel? Nice words for the Palestinians, weapons for Israel. That is not balance. That is complicity in genocide. You would never, in face of Russian war crimes in Ukraine, I have never heard you speak about a balanced approach. There's 40 EU sanction regimes and not one on Israel that stands accused in front of the international courts of genocide.
MEP Marc Botenga joins us now. Marc Botenga, you have been consistently outspoken and fiercely critical of EU foreign policy. Since you made that speech at the EU Parliament in Brussels about a year ago, what, if anything, has changed?
Well, I think public pressure on EU institutions and on member states has increased, and this has shifted the narrative a little bit, the rhetoric that we've been hearing. Substantially, there's been no policy change, I'd say. We've seen very small measures, but what has shifted has Ursula von der Leyen, who's chairwoman of the European Commission, has had to come in front of the European Parliament to say, I propose some measures against Israel. Now this was mostly performative because she knew it was not going to be true. Herself, behind closed doors, was advocating against these measures. But the increase, I would say, in public pressure from globally civil society and the people in Europe against what has been correctly perceived as active complicity on behalf of European nations with a genocide, this has shifted.
But has it mostly been performative, as you say, or are we seeing significant change? Because just recently the EU agreed sanctions against a group of Israeli settlers. Some of your colleagues welcomed it as a baby step, but an important first step. How do you see it?
Well, I mean, it is really a baby step. It is basically, I mean, we need to know this, like this so-called settler violence against Palestinians, Palestinian communities in the West Bank. It's not something new, it's been ongoing. And 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, the European diplomacy, so the European External Action Service spokesperson, defined it as settler terrorism. Why? Because it's clearly violence which has it's terrorizing civilians, and it has a political objective. The political objective is ethnic cleansing. It's taking control, and the Israeli government is very open about this, taking control of the entire West Bank and, driving Palestinians out. Now, if this is terrorism, and you can see that this is done with the active support of the Israeli state, it's being promoted by the Israeli state. If you're on the ground, you can see how the Israeli army supports the settlers, supports this ethnic cleansing. Then just sanctioning 1-2 organizations or 1 or 2 individuals, it's not going to cut it. You can say we took some measures, but basically structurally you're still funding, financing, and arming the entire Israeli enterprise of colonization.
Is it anything more than cosmetic, just a way for the EU to say that we are doing something?
To an extent, it is cosmetic. I don't think many people are fooled by it. I mean, you do know that this is going on. You speak about a 2-state solution, about recognizing Palestinian state. You can see the reality on the ground, be it in Gaza, be it in the West Bank, be it in East Jerusalem. Now, positively, the only reason they're doing this is because of public pressure. So let's be very clear on this. They're showing something because they know that there's public pressure domestically and globally. Because the credibility of the EU, the EU has always said we've got soft power. People believe us when we speak about international law, human rights, democracy. Now this has not eroded, I'd say collapsed over the last few years because of what has been going on in Gaza.
But if the list of sanctioned settlers doesn't include some of the most extremist Israeli ministers like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, what real impact will it have?
Or will have very little impact. Let's be very clear. And it's not just about sanctioning even the individual ministers, but you're right to point out that other countries have sanctioned these ministers.
Including the UK.
Including the UK, including, I believe, also New Zealand and a number of other actors. The EU and European countries are apparently not ready to do even that. Just sanction the most extremist, the most far-right
Why not?
ministers.
What's holding them back? Is it Germany? Is it Italy?
Well, I think that it's very often we point to certain member states saying Germany really doesn't want it, or at the time it was Hungary saying, there's a veto from Hungary. But I think that's missing the point. First of all, you'll notice that there's no massive pressure from other member states on Germany to switch position. While in the past we've seen it, when Hungary was blocking a certain support for Ukraine, there was massive pressure from other member states, from the European Commission on Hungary to say shift position. When Greece 10 years ago said we no longer want to obey the socio-economic policies of the EU, massive pressure to make the country obey. We don't see that today.
Why don't we see it?
Well, because I think there's more to it than just the veto of this or the other country. It's about, I think we underestimate, or at least publicly it's underestimated, how deeply Israel and the Israeli, let's say, colonial state is integrated, embedded into the European system. This is widely underreported. It's very deep. We've got the association agreement, which is a privileged partner agreement the European Union has with Israel. It's more than just a trade relationship. It's much more than that. You have public subsidies, public funds from European programs going to Israeli companies, Israeli universities, and so on. So there's this deep embeddedness, I'd say, or interrelation connection between the Israeli colonial project and the EU economy.
And this trade agreement is probably the key leverage that the EU holds if it wants to force Israel to change course.
Absolutely.
Is it wishful thinking that it be reviewed or even suspended?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I can see something tilting because of, what we're discussing on this public pressure, the disgust that many people throughout Europe, from the Netherlands to Italy, from Spain to Germany as well, have expressed in regard to the active EU support for the ongoing genocide and ethnic cleansing in Palestine. This has, shifted the narrative, the rhetoric a little bit, but is also basically putting a lot of pressure on national governments to look at least at the association agreement. 10 years ago it would have been very weird to say we need to suspend this association agreement. Today it is part of the mainstream narrative, and so that is very important. Of course, as soon as this public pressure would in any way subside, this will be taken off the table, because they don't want, the European, most of the member states, some exceptions, but most of the member states and the European Commission really don't want it.
And to impose any meaningful sanctions on Israel, which is something that's never happened, you'd need unanimity, a consensus among all 27 member states. One of your fellow MEPs, a German member of the European Parliament, Hildegard Bentele, who chairs the EU Parliament delegation on relations with Israel, she said this recently: if the EU doesn't take sanctions off the table, it won't be considered as a partner. She warned essentially of a blowback if Israel is punished. Your thoughts?
I'm not sure what blowback there could be. Let's be very, very clear. So Israel, it's about 30% of its trade is with the EU, right? If we would suspend that agreement, that privileged agreement, once again, it's not just trade relations, right? It's privileged trade relations. If we would say we're going to suspend that, that would put massive pressure on Israel at all levels. And we need to be very, very clear about that. It would be the first time. And so far, anything the EU has said or done has been flatly ignored by Israel, because they know there's a fundamental support both by the EU and member states. So, the EU shouldn't be seen as a partner by Israel. Like, what are you partnering with? Israel is, be it in Lebanon, be it in Syria, be it throughout Palestine, committing the worst crimes possible under international law. Do you want to partner with that? Is that the kind of activities, the kind of crimes you want to be a partner to? The International Court of Justice has been very clear that there should be no support whatsoever for the illegal colonization of Palestine on behalf of third-party states. So it's very, very clear what our obligations are. And basically, Madam Bentele is arguing that we should stay complicit to the worst crimes under international law.
Is it complicity? You've criticized EU leaders, you've accused the foreign policy chief of being selective by calling for a balanced approach towards Israel and not doing the same towards Russia. Is this active complicity, or is it something else?
Well, it's very clear that there's an active complicity when you're sending weapons. It's very difficult to be, to call it anything else than active complicity.
30% of Israel's weapons come from the EU, mostly from Germany.
From the EU or through the EU as well, there's weapons transport. Some EU countries have said we won't allow that anymore, which is very positive, which is also a reaction to mobilization, certain workers, for example, blocking ports at airports and so on. But there's also the funding. The funding is very, very important as well. All of the public subsidies, the public EU funds that go to Israel, that are used for dual-use projects and others, this all gives Israel not just the financial, military support it needs, it also gives the political and diplomatic cover for what Israel is doing, because you're basically normalizing all of these crimes, all of these aggressions, ethnic cleansing, genocide, all of these things that basically, at school, they teach you are the worst of things. And they teach them as if it was something from the past, right? And right now, you can see EU governments actively supporting that. So yes, that is complicity. There's no doubt about this.
How much of this is also explained by the fact that the EU has become far too aligned with US interests and priorities?
Well, part of it is, there's also US pressure very clearly on the EU, on member states to act in a specific way. And we have seen that the EU has been particularly unwilling, I wouldn't say unable, but unwilling to condemn any violations of international law by the US. They have not condemned.
We saw this in the case of Iran.
Of Iran, for example, a very clear case, really, where the US twice, launched a war of aggression against a sovereign country. Very similar in that perspective to what happened with Russia and Ukraine, and unable to even say this is a violation of international law. We've had a lot of debates, and I hear Ursula von der Leyen, so the head of the European Commission, but also the High Representative, speak about how Iran attacked countries in the region, leaving out the part where the United States and Israel actually, attacked Iran in a blatant case of a war of aggression. Also in Venezuela, when the United States kidnapped a president of a country, something unimaginable until a few years ago.
Where does it leave the credibility of the EU?
Oh, but I think the global credibility has, as I said, not just eroded; it's collapsed to a large. I mean, it's important to know that if you try to understand EU foreign policy today through the prism of through the lens of how would I say, human rights, international law, democracy, you're not going to understand it. You're not going to understand it because there's nothing that justifies, I don't know, from an international law perspective, the support they're giving to Israel, or the fact that they're not condemning the occupation of part of Lebanon by Israel, or the aggression against Iran, or the ethnic cleansing and the genocide in Palestine. From a perspective of democracy as well, we complain about democracy in certain countries, take Iran, but we will not condemn it in other countries that are allied to our interests. I don't know, Saudi Arabia, for example, very silent on that side. And EU credibility on human rights and international law globally has, I think, largely disappeared. But if you look at EU foreign policy from what I would call an imperialist perspective, then it makes much more sense. Because the EU has been supporting basically the destruction of many countries in the Middle East. Some of them, they've been destroyed with the support of certain EU member states. I'm thinking of Libya, thinking of Iraq, and others we've been basically not condemning the work Israel and the United States have been doing.
Yet they give aid to these countries, the EU does.
Yes, this is a very interesting part where we say, on the one hand, we fund and arm, for example, Israel. On the other hand, we also give some humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, see how balanced we are. If you wouldn't be giving the weapons, so you wouldn't be funding Israel, maybe those bombs wouldn't be falling. If you'd be condemning Israel, sanctioning Israel for what it is doing in Lebanon, for what it is doing throughout the region, they might actually stop the conflict, stop the wars, rather than say, well, I know you're getting, ethnically cleansed, but we'll fund a little school for you, or we'll fund a little tent for you. There's something, on the one hand, it sounds very nice, very lofty, we're giving humanitarian assistance, and sometimes that's needed. But at the same time, the structural picture is very much one of complicity with the crimes, and then giving some, a little bit of band-aid to the victims.
Has the EU become structurally subordinate to US power, to US colonial interests, or is it in its own DNA to react the way it does?
I think both of them. I mean, there is a structural submissiveness to the United States. This is since the Second World War, at least for part of Europe, and increasingly so since the end of the bipolar world order. But there is also something in its DNA. If you look at it, there's a continuity. You had, of course, many European countries with colonial powers. After the decolonization movement, they used the so-called debt trap, to make sure that, for example, African countries would remain, under the control, economic control at least, dependent on EU countries. You see that in Western Africa, you see that in other countries, also in the Middle East. And there's one continuity, that is that the emergence of autonomous, sovereign countries, aside from what you think about their political system, is seen as a threat, because these countries could decide to, sell their natural resources at a higher price, sell it to someone else that offers at a higher price, the critical raw materials, all of these things. It's much nicer if these countries can't defend themselves. And if you look at the region, what's happened in Libya, what's happened in Syria, and so on, these countries have been broadly destroyed, are no longer able very often to function as sovereign states.
What does European sovereignty mean today in practical terms, when quite often the EU puts itself in a subordinate position?
Well, today it's very, very clearly the idea, the dream of governing the world with the United States. There's this idea of the global West being able to govern the world, and perhaps even to share the world. And this was very clear when you had the discussion you still have on Greenland. When Donald Trump said, I'm going to take Greenland, right? And the Europeans were outraged. But they were outraged because Donald Trump was behaving and was treating them the way many southern countries, many countries of the global south, have been treated by the Europeans and by the Americans for decades or perhaps centuries. And you can see right now these negotiations ongoing. Basically, the European Union is giving in on Greenland. We're negotiating with the United States, saying, how many bases you want? You want 3 bases? We'll give you 3 bases. So there's this idea of a shared interest in dominating the rest of the world. Rather than say we're going to a multipolar world, and we need to diversify our relationships. We cannot be dependent on, a privileged partnership with the United States. We need to develop our ties to, I don't know, China, India, South Africa, Brazil, whatever country. And this is a fundamentally different mindset.
And the EU is now discussing ways to try to guarantee freedom of navigation along the Strait of Hormuz, another way to support the United States.
Yes, it's very interesting. Like the Strait of Hormuz was open before the United States attacked Iran, but the EU was unable to, blame the United States clearly or condemn that attack, and is now saying, yeah, we need to guarantee the freedom of navigation. We might even send, military aid, ships, battleships. The French are sending their aircraft carrier. Now, this is, of course, once again turning things upside down because they're framing it as a defensive mission. But obviously, it's a defensive mission in a very aggressive war. The United States aggressed Iran. This is why then the Iranians very predictably closed the Strait of Hormuz. Then Trump closed the Strait of Hormuz as well. But none of this is part of the equation. And it's a way, I feel, of EU member states kind of showing their subordination to the United States. Without EU logistical support for this war against Iran, the war would have been very, very difficult and would have looked even worse for the United States. So today the signal is there of like, we're going to support the US, but only defensively, which is complete nonsense, let's be very honest. But it is a way of signaling we're on your side in the destruction of another sovereign country in the Middle East.
In terms of the EU member states, when you look at all 27 of them, which are the ones that have stood out for you in standing up to this type of subordination?
Well, I think the Spanish coalition government has been rather outspoken. They've taken a number of decisions also on, for example, the refusing to have the bases on their territory used by the United States for this war. You've seen Slovenia that has been very outspoken also on the genocide, came to the European Parliament calling what was happening in Gaza a genocide. You had the Irish government also rather outspoken. So there's a number of countries that, and you can see that other countries like Belgium, like France, they need to maneuver. Because they don't want to lose their foothold, let's put it in the Middle East on one hand, or Western Asia, whatever side you're looking at it from. And on the other hand, they need to calm down their own population. So this public outrage, right? And you can see that very much President Macron, strong supporter historically also of Israel, needs to say, but we'll recognize the Palestinian state. So you can really see the shifting and the tilting dynamics within EU member states one by one.
Including in Norway and Sweden.
Absolutely.
And other countries like that. Finally, just how optimistic are you that public pressure, which is still continuing in so many different European capitals, will eventually lead to more pressure on Israel?
Oh, I'm always optimistic, and I'm optimistic. Why? Because it's about much more than just the situation in the region. It's about the kind of world we are constructing. Are we accepting that our governments, our European governments, are actively constructing a world where bombing schools, where destroying hospitals, executing journalists is normal? Is that the kind of world of chaos, of war, of destruction we want to normalize, we want our governments to stand for? No. The vast majority of Europeans will stand against this and are standing against this. And so I believe that if we manage to maintain the momentum and the pressure, showing that this is not just about one country or one people or one region, but it is about the world we're going to live in tomorrow, the world our children are going to grow up in, is that going to be a world of peace, of international law, of solidarity, or one of blunt imperialism and blunt war sponsored by our own governments? Those that are elected because they speak about democracy, because they speak about human rights. Are we going to stand for that hypocrisy? I don't believe the majority of the people will. So in that sense, I'm very optimistic, but there's a long road to go.
Realistically, what will it take?
I don't want to put a timeline on that. History is not a linear movement. I think no one would have expected some of the discourse we have now in regard to Israel, to the region, to be mainstream only 5 years ago. So things have shifted quickly. And there's this expression of someone saying that you have decades where nothing happens, and then you have a few years where decades happen. And I think we're in that kind of moment right now.
Marc Botenga, Member of the European Parliament, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As Marc Botenga says, it's about what kind of world we want to live in and whether war crimes should be accepted as normal. The credibility of institutions like the EU is at stake. Will they finally take action and stand up for international law? Or will they continue to turn a blind eye to blatant violations? If the status quo remains unchanged, Europe's complicity will only deepen. That's all from me, Rida Fakhri, and the entire team. Thanks for watching.